When he goes over there, he finds her sliding glass door was unlocked. So she didn't lock her door. He just opened the door and went in. She hears him and actually comes out of her bedroom, and there's a fight. He admits to being in the house for almost 4 hours. In that 4-hour period, because she was calling 911.
What is he doing in that time?
This is where things start to get really disturbing for me.
62-year-old Nancy Woodrum was last seen Friday afternoon. After her disappearance, posters with her picture were plastered all over the area.
This is nuts. I didn't think nothing like this would be going on.
Welcome to Socialite Crime Club. What kind of big red button topics are we talking about today?
I'm calling this episode Constitutional Confusion. You know, we dress black and white today for a reason, because interpreting the Constitution isn't always black and white. And sometimes it's a really bitter pill to swallow when we realize our expectation of privacy can kill us. And this is going to be a really scary episode for some people, and you've got to stick to the end because we're dropping a bomb today.
I don't want to die.
Don't forget to mark your calendars for Sunday, September 15th for our live episode where we're going to further discuss today's topics. And I've got to have a little disclaimer here. I rewrote this episode like 4 or 5 times because every time I engage in a conversation with somebody, my opinion's changed. This episode is going to trigger feelings of our audience. You're going to feel things as we start to explain some of the new case law that's coming out that's preventing law enforcement from actually solving heinous, brutal crimes. We have a poll, a little survey we've put together in our community tab. We want people to take that. And then during the live, we're going to get into this and discuss our feelings, but more importantly, your feelings. So don't forget to join us Sunday, September 15th. Let us know how you feel about these topics because they are hot topics that are definitely going to change the landscape of how law enforcement investigates.
Thank you everyone for clicking the subscribe button to join our channel. And once you do that, please don't forget to click the bell icon so that you receive notifications of all of our upcoming content that we're creating for you.
I keep reading in comments about how we need swag. Well, guess what, people? We got swag. Go to our YouTube page, the home page, and when you get there, you're going to see our home tab, the video tab, the shorts tab. If you keep going all the way to the right, we have a store tab. Click on that store tab. You're going to see all of our amazing swag. Feel free to order as much of it as you would like. We'll make more. So enjoy our swag. It's there.
Today's content falls under our Gritty Crime series. It is raw, unflinching, and filled with violence and some graphic details. It's not really for the faint of heart, so please watch this episode with some caution.
I bet you're excited to get the show started today.
I am.
Well, before we do not fast forward, socialites. Give me a second here. If you like our content, please support those who support us. They're helping us make more content for you. The least you can do is click on this little link right here. Aura.com/Socialite Crime Club. We'll wait for you. Pause the show, click on it, go check it out. That link is going to take you to a free trial of their product. And let me explain really quick what this product is. Carrie and I are really digging this thing right now. It's a mobile app that goes on your phone. When you sync it up to all of your financial stuff, it actually monitors your credit, your finances, your bank account, your home loans. So if somebody's trying to steal your home loan literally from you, it'll alert you as soon as there's some type of fraudulent behavior.
Or create another mortgage in your name somewhere.
Right. You know how much Darren would have liked that with the Darren Hale case? Ugh, poor guy. They also have this AI that actually is going to pre-screen all of your phone calls and text messages. And it's pre-screening for spam. It's going to eliminate those spam calls and those spam text messages.
Which I love.
Probably your favorite. It will provide you with a VPN so you can surf the internet with some type of privacy, which is always a nice thing. And my favorite piece of this, and we have a whole episode coming up where we're really going to get into this more. They have parental controls. It allows you to monitor your child's device for a number of things. Number one, sexual predators. It looks at different applications where your children may be chatting with other people, and it's going to monitor those chats for any type of behavior that looks like a sexual predator or potential cyberbullying, and it's going to alert you to this. This is a life-saving application when you look at it with that type of context of what it's providing. Furthermore, you can also control what sites your children have access to, and then you can do dark out periods where you can actually make their phone no longer connect to the internet no matter what they do from 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. or whatever your time frame is. So some really cool parental controls that I think will make a big difference in keeping our children safe online. So again, do us a favor. Take just a couple minutes, click on this link, aura.com/Socialite Crime Club. Sign up for the free trial. Give it a go. See if you like it.
How exactly does our right to privacy kill us?
All right, we got to get into this, and it's going to be a little bit of a journey for our socialites today. There's a recent ruling out of the 5th District Court of Appeals. So it's the U.S. Court of Appeals, 5th District, which covers Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. And the case itself is U.S. versus Jamar Smith. And this case involves a Google Geofence. And we've used Google Geofences. The court ruled they're unconstitutional.
How recent was this case?
Just came out in August. This is kind of a big deal because the 4th Circuit Court of Appeals had just recently ruled that geofences were fine. The 5th took another case, looked at it, and came out and said, not only are they unconstitutional, but we feel our colleagues over there at the 4th, they got it wrong. And they're actually kind of harsh in talking about how the 4th got it wrong, right, which is pretty rare. Most of the time you don't see one appeals court kind of take an aim at another appeals court's decision.
Especially directly within a written opinion.
Right. Now, I have no doubt the U.S. Attorney's Office will be appealing this decision. This is going to go to the Supreme Court. It's just a matter of time. So nothing is finalized across the law of the land of the United States. Right now, it just affects the 5th District. But there's some really interesting tidbits here. I want to come out from the beginning and say, I absolutely hate this ruling. Every fiber of my being wants to fight it. But when I break it down and I look at it, I'm worried they're right. Yeah. And that's when constitutional confusion comes in, where, of course, we support the Constitution until you realize, oh, wait a second, right, this is going to hurt us.
On this entire topic, I do find myself walking the boundary of both sides of this topic. And I'm finding that equally on both sides, I'm feeling discomfort and comfort from both sides of the opinion.
Yeah, it's really divisive, right?
And I'm grappling with it. Yeah.
It is. I have rewritten this episode 3 times in the last 36 hours. I've talked to every scholar I can think of on the legal side. You and I have had a debate on this, and we were split for a while. I think we still are in different parts of it.
We've talked to our kids, which some of their opinions really surprised me in the answers that they gave.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about this specific case, U.S. versus Jamar Smith. It involves the U.S. Postal Service, and it's the robbery of a postal truck. And people might think, who robs a postal truck? Well, what a lot of people don't realize is the U.S. Postal Service also sells money orders. So they sell stamps, they sell money orders, they take a lot of cash. Right, wrong, or indifferent, they transport that cash in mail bags on the little mail trucks. So they'll all go to a central location, and then that central location will take them to a bank.
And how much cash could actually be in these mail bags at any given time?
I've actually worked a few of these cases. This isn't a one and done thing. I've seen several of these cases all over the country. I've seen cases of over 300,000 of cash in a mail bag with some lonely postal carrier.
Oh my goodness. That seems so silly. It seems such an outdated,
yes. Welcome to the post office.
Pony Express thing to do.
Yes. In this particular case, it was just over $60,000. And it has to make you think a little bit. This is an inside job. People aren't stealing these mail bags every day. And the one time they do steal the mail bag, there's 60 grand in it. Come on. There's a link.
I would imagine, but I don't know for sure, that the U.S. Postal Service would also have some type of security process in place from transporting that money from a mail post office to a vehicle to where it needs to get to next.
I can think of at least 3 cases that I've been consulted on that involve this. So you would also think that after maybe the first 2 or 3 times, they would change their policy, but who knows?
It's the government.
Yeah, they do have these 2 suspects on surveillance video just prior to the robbery, and you can see them using their phones. You can also see a vehicle. So they have suspect description. They know they're using phones. They have vehicle descriptions. But all normal investigative procedures don't pan out. They can't identify who these suspects are. The postal investigators working this case, this is a 2018 case, by the way, they hear about this new thing called a Google Geofence. So they consult with a couple other law enforcement agencies, then they consult with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and they decide to write a warrant to go after a Google Geofence. That warrant is going to produce really good data, and they're going to identify their 2 suspects. And this is the crutch of the whole case, is they now build the case against these 2 suspects, and they're going to go to trial.
But currently, the warrant that they wrote follows the letter of the law right now of what we know about writing search warrants to obtain Google location information.
Yeah, what's interesting here is they use the same warrant template that hundreds of police agencies have used successfully. And that's probably a really good point to bring up. Yeah, we're going to highlight one case, but I want to make it really clear. The Postal Service didn't do something different than the other couple hundred law enforcement agencies and federal agencies that have done the exact same thing.
Right.
So it's not something they did, it's the process itself. And to your point, there's been a lot of successful prosecutions using this, and the 4th District Court of Appeals actually upheld that these are legal justified searches.
Right.
And we've helped a lot of agencies with this. I won't say we were the pioneers with Google Geofences, but I know I was involved in creating some of the first warrant templates served on Google. In fact, funny side story. I was at a conference where one of the Google attorneys was doing a presentation for law enforcement of the type of data Google can give to law enforcement with a search warrant and what they were expecting. And I had some questions about our search warrant template. So on a break, I went up to her and I started talking to her and I showed her my template. And I was asking, like, hey, we've been thinking about making some changes. What are your thoughts on this? And she looked at it and she's like, where did you get this? I said, well, no, it's our template. We help a lot of law enforcement officers with these type of investigations.
You created it. You created the verbiage in it with your understanding of geolocation information.
Right. And as soon as she realized that I had written that warrant and that's our template, she's like, so you're the one. And she actually told me, no, I've seen that template hundreds of times. And so, like I said, I'm not saying we were the pioneers of it, but we definitely had a major impact in it.
Well, we did provide the template for free to law enforcement and made it very accessible with some of the tools and resources we had with the company that we built.
Yeah, and we've done so many of these cases, I have to be honest, I've lost count. I don't know how many times we've helped agencies with Google Geofences where it impacted their case.
So there's been precedents set that Google location information is perfectly legal to use as long as you use the correct search warrant processes and procedures.
That was the thought.
Yeah.
So let's get into what a Google Geofence is. And I don't want to make this a boring episode where we just talk all this legal stuff.
But it is very boring. That's why I chose these cups, these mugs.
Because they're boring?
They're what I pictured some old Supreme Court justices drinking from when they're sitting around discussing very important historical boring topics, yeah, case law, and it seemed appropriate.
So we're using boring cups today.
Yeah, boring cups for boring case law, but it's important and it does impact you. People
are going to be surprised, and like I said, when we get to the end of today's episode, I'm dropping a bomb, so stick around. This is a big deal, but I don't want to explain Google Geofences in a boring legal standard. I want people to understand the real impact. So we're going to use a case that I helped with on a Google Geofence. So we got a picture here. This is Nancy Woodrum. Mm-hmm. She's 62 years of age at this time. So this is a picture of her when she was around 62. She lives in Paso Robles.
Paso Robles.
That's what I said. San Luis Obispo County, California. She's a hairdresser. Very well-known hairdresser.
Okay.
Like everybody in town goes to her.
Okay.
She lives with her daughter, who is an adult. And I'll kind of explain the living situation is kind of unique. Normally, I stay away from religion when it has something to do with victims or a particular suspect. I just don't like getting into religious topics. It can be very sensitive for people, and it's just not productive. However, in this particular case, I'm going to make a little exception because it is important to understand. Nancy was an extremely devout Jehovah's Witness.
Okay.
And if I was to ask you, what's the first thing you think of when I say Jehovah's Witness?
Well, I first think of the little pamphlets that are always left in the crevice of the door. But you know what's interesting to me too about Jehovah's Witnesses is that usually when someone does come to the door, it's typically a female coming to the door. I rarely see male Jehovah's Witnesses coming to the door to talk about their religion.
Yeah, Jehovah's Witnesses are very engaged in promoting their gospel, right? It's like a recruiting, for lack of a better term. They're heavy into the recruiting.
Right.
And that's going to play a little bit of a role in this case. So that's why I'm laying a little bit of foundation here for our socialites to understand. Nancy is a very devout Jehovah's Witness. She does believe in spreading that gospel to everybody she comes in contact with. This is her husband, Robert Woodrum. That is a picture from the 70s, by the way.
I hope so.
Maybe the late 60s.
That hair. Wow.
He and Nancy got married in 1977. He's going to unfortunately die from a heart attack in 2012, but they were married for 35 years.
Oh, wow.
So they've been together a long time. They have a huge, beautiful house just outside of Paso. But the death changes things a little bit. So I'm going to show a picture here of the property. This is where Nancy lives. And the red little boundary there, that is the property line. It's 6 acres. So she has a pretty good chunk of property.
Yeah.
Now, as you look at that, you see the tennis courts are obvious to see there. Directly to the left of the tennis courts, that's the guest house. And the guest house has kind of the main house part of the guest house, and then there's a studio suite. Mm-hmm. Nancy lives in the studio suite of the guest house. Her daughter lives in the rest of the guest house.
I'd like to have a studio suite in our backyard.
Yeah, I'm sure you would. Okay, just below the guest house, there's actually a much bigger house, and it's not as easy to see because there's more trees around it.
You can definitely see, though, there's far more square footage.
Right, and then towards the top of the screen there, that red roof, that's the barn, and then you can kind of see the little horse arena off to the far right. So it's a horse property. There's a pool there. It's 12 bedroom, 8 bath. It can sleep up to 28.
Wow.
Pool, jacuzzi, fire pit, barbecue, playhouse, tennis courts, horses. It's got the whole thing. She turns it into an Airbnb. So that's why her and her daughter lived in the guest house, and then they Airbnb the main house.
For extra income since her husband's death.
Correct. Here's a picture of the main house, so you kind of get an idea.
It's really beautiful. It almost looks a combination of traditional and Victorian.
Yeah. The inside is very Victorian.
It's a big, bright white house with a wraparound porch and some Victorian style peaks around the windows.
Yeah, it's a pretty house.
Yeah.
And it's in a pretty area. There's a lot of wineries in this area. So there's several wineries, just down the road from them. Mm-hmm. So she does very well with the Airbnb. It is a very popular Airbnb in this area. Like I was saying, Nancy and her daughter lived in the studio apartment guest house. It's about 30 meters, so 90 feet, less than 100 feet from the main building. So they are pretty close. Here's a picture of that studio guest house, so you can kind of see the same.
Which is also a very beautiful elevation. It's like a farm-style ranch home.
Well, it has a garage. I mean, it looks like a house. When I say guest house, I want people to understand it's a house.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's much bigger than a casita.
Yeah, it's a very nice piece of property altogether. Now, on May 4th, 2018, somebody has rented this Airbnb, and it's a wedding party, 20 people. So there's 10 couples. The wedding is actually just down the road a little bit at one of these wineries, but the wedding party themselves are staying at this Airbnb. Nancy is also staying there in the guest house. Now, May 4th is a Friday, so the wedding party that night goes out to a rehearsal dinner, so they're all at dinner, and then they're going to come home later in the night. Nancy is seen on the property that day and that evening from the wedding party, so everything seems fine. She's on the property. She's going to go to bed. No big deal. The next morning, she has plans to meet a couple of her friends at breakfast. She doesn't show, which is very unusual for Nancy. Okay. So the friends are a little bit worried. They call her daughter. And I'm not sure why the daughter involved the neighbor, but the daughter and the neighbor end up going to the guest house to check on Nancy. The first thing they notice is they pass the barn, the horses aren't fed, which is very unusual as well. So they're already a little bit hinked up. They find the sliding glass door to the studio is open, which is not normal either. And then as they go inside, there's actually little blood droplets all over the house.
I wondered if she had already seen some of the blood and her hackles raised a little bit and she went to go get the neighbor. And then they started noticing other things that seemed out of sorts.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of information on why the neighbor was involved. The neighbor is legit. That has nothing to do with the crime. I think maybe just to your point, a little bit of moral support because she's a little bit worried about what she's about to find.
Yeah.
When the daughter gets inside of Nancy's bedroom, the blood droplets turn into blood puddles. So there's large deposits of blood there. Kind of weird. All of the bedding is gone, but there's a bloody pillow. And on one side of the bloody pillow is a very recognizable handprint in blood. So there's a bloody handprint.
Was it possible at all to identify fingerprints from the handprint?
No, it's not that clear, but you can definitely make out it was made by a handprint.
Okay. Her
cell phone is still there. Her car keys, her car is still there. Her shoes are there. The TV's on. So it's kind of a little bit weird. Outside the sliding glass door, you can see fresh tire tracks. And behind the tire tracks, you can see what it looks like maybe a little scuffle or some marks in the dirt where maybe there's some type of something going on where people are maybe scuffling or trying to move stuff. It's hard to tell.
The dirt was extremely disturbed in a way that it's not normal.
Yeah, so obviously daughter's concerned. She's going to call 911 and this is going to start the criminal investigation. I want to talk a little bit about wedding bad omens. What would you consider a bad omen at a wedding?
Probably lightning striking the groom.
Right? That would be a bad omen. How about your Airbnb where your entire wedding party is just gets shut down for a crime scene and everybody in your wedding party is being interviewed by homicide detectives on the day of your wedding to see if they killed it?
It is ominous. I would agree.
Yeah, it kind of screws up your wedding a little bit. Yeah. So and the reason I bring this up is law enforcement has to look at the people who are on the property that night, right? And they start interviewing this wedding party, and one of the people in the wedding party is acting really suspicious. He admits to having contact with Nancy that afternoon and early evening. He tells them that when everybody went to the rehearsal dinner that night, he stayed behind. Just didn't feel like going to the rehearsal dinner. They didn't really focus on that too much until they found a bunch of pictures of him at the rehearsal dinner. So now they're thinking, wait, why would he lie and tell us he was at the scene?
And other wedding guest parties are confirming he was at the rehearsal dinner.
100%. And confirming with pictures, no, he was there. Look, I have a picture of him sitting next to me.
Okay.
So the detectives are just, okay, this is weird. So they interview him a second time and he completely changes his story. He's like, yeah, I don't know why I told you guys that.
He's just a wedding crasher. He doesn't even actually belong there. No one really knows him.
Right. But kind of a really weird dilemma.
Why would you say that when you know they're investigating a crime?
It just goes back to that when you put people in a weird situation with law enforcement questioning them, sometimes people just say weird things that don't mean anything about the crime.
They do, yeah. It does amaze me, actually.
Now, ultimately, they're going to get, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, they're going to get suspect DNA from the blood inside of the house.
Okay.
This particular wedding party guy, they're going to test his DNA against the suspect DNA. It's not him. So he'll be cleared. But it definitely throws a monkey wrench into the wedding plans that day, right? It's one way to screw up a wedding.
Yeah, it gives you something to think about when you're saying your vows.
Yeah, right. California Highway Patrol is going to call these detectives while they're still at the scene working the crime scene. They know that there's some type of crime scene over there, but not too far down the road on Highway 58, Highway Patrol comes across a lot of bedding, sheets and blankets, bloody, and clothing that are off in a ditch, kind of tangled up in a little bit of barbed wire.
Okay.
So they call the county and they're like, hey, are you guys working a homicide scene? We just found a bunch of bloody items. So they send a detective over there. The daughter goes over there and identifies the bedding as that's my mom's bedding. Oh, those are my mom's clothes.
Oh.
So now we have a second crime scene. We have the initial crime scene there at the guest house, but now we have a second crime scene a couple miles down the road off of Highway 58.
And how much later, what was the amount of time that went by before they actually found the bedding and all of that?
I want to say half a day because investigators are still actively working the initial crime scene at the house when Highway Patrol finds this. So it's in close proximity to when the actual crime itself was discovered.
Okay.
If you continue on this path from the house to where the clothes are and you keep going, you end up out in this mountain range, but it's more of a rolling grassland hill range.
Okay.
Very rural, very isolated, very rural. So just something to keep in mind. Law enforcement's going to discover a 911 call that was made from Nancy's home phone. So it's not a cell phone, it's her landline at 12:17 a.m. So just after midnight, Nancy calls 911. It doesn't connect. It's only for 0 seconds. It never connects, but somebody dialed 911 and then for whatever reason, something happens where that call doesn't go through.
So maybe the line was pulled out of the jack in the wall or somebody hung up the phone.
Yeah, something we don't know, but we have a timestamp of somebody attempting to call 911 from her studio apartment at 12:17. This is really important that we'll come back to. When they start looking at the blood evidence, they do find two distinct DNA profiles. They have Nancy's blood, which is the majority of the blood throughout the property, but mixed in with Nancy's blood, they get an unknown adult male's DNA. So now they have what they believe is suspect DNA profile, and it's full profile. So it's not a half profile. It's not the YSTR we've talked about in other episodes. This is a full profile. There's problems, though, entering this into CODIS.
What is CODIS?
CODIS is a law enforcement database that DNA is loaded into, but there has to be very strict requirements met to load this DNA into the CODIS system. So, for example, I'm convicted of a sexual offense. one of the things I'm sentenced to in my sentencing is to provide a DNA sample to the CODIS database. Your victim, I can load victim DNA into CODIS to maybe try to identify that victim. Sexual assaults, I can actually load victim sexual assault DNA into CODIS for certain reasons. But like I said, there's a whole page of requirements I have to meet. It's very regulated. They don't like mixtures. So anytime I have my victim's blood and then I have a male profile mixed into it, it causes some issues with the CODIS database. So they can't run this through CODIS because it doesn't meet the requirements. So just another important thing to think about there.
Okay.
They're going to develop another suspect, which is Nancy's son.
Oh.
They do not get along.
How was he developed as a suspect? Just because they don't get along?
And I don't want to throw the daughter under the bus because I'm not 100% sure of this, but they get a lot of information from other people. I'm assuming the daughter would probably know as much as anybody else. Mm-hmm. Nancy and her son do not get along. And I think it's over some financial stuff, but I don't know all the specifics. The way law enforcement describes it, he's just a jerk. He will not cooperate. He won't talk to them. They have a DNA sample, so they will say, hey, we can rule you out as a suspect. We just need a DNA sample, and he won't give it.
He just hates his mom so much he doesn't even care that she's dead at that point, it sounds like.
Yeah, imagine one of your parents being killed, murdered. They can't find the body. They have DNA, and they just want to eliminate you to move about.
And my own children wouldn't even talk about me.
And they won't even give law enforcement a DNA sample to say I didn't do it.
Yeah, that is a bit suspicious, but at the same time, it's really sad.
Yeah, there's obviously some deep-seated issues here, right?
Yeah.
Now, they're going to do surveillance on him for a number of days, and they're going to see him discard, I think it's a bottle, but they're going to see him discard something that he was drinking out of, and they get his DNA. He's ruled out. It's not him. He's just a jerk.
Okay.
Maybe justified.
It happens.
I don't know the relationship, but yeah.
There are a lot of people out there like that.
And once they rule him out, effectively, they have no other suspects. There's no other leads to go on. This case is going to cold case status. So they're struggling to put it together.
How long had it sat in that potential cold case ongoing investigation that they were just getting colder and colder?
They're probably about 60 to 90 days in at this point. So, with cases like this, typically, if you don't have pretty clear direction in that first 30 days or so, it can go cold really quick because it's not getting better, right? It's getting worse the further time marches on. Now, there is one other interesting thing that they looked into here is Nancy and her daughter were actually in the process of selling this house. They were under contract. They had just had the home inspection, and a handful of things popped up in the home inspections, like they do. Yeah. And she had hired a contractor to take care of all these issues in the home inspection. So leading up to her murder for a couple of weeks there was multiple workers and this contractor that were on the property. Okay. People are explaining this contractor is also just a terrible jerk, and he and Nancy didn't get along, and it was over finances again, and he just was a very difficult person. He had a terrible anger problem. So law enforcement interviews him and all of the workers trying to get a better feel. Nothing comes out of it. And eventually they're going to also rule out this contractor. He is not the suspect.
Was he the only contractor that they had worked with, though?
He was the only actual contractor, but then this contractor had subcontractors, handymen, painters, plumbers that worked under him. So there was a number of workers, but they all worked for or through this contractor.
Got it.
He had a major criminal history, and I think that's what tipped him off in the beginning. He had a pretty extensive criminal history, so he just looked like a possible suspect based on his criminal history, and I don't know what all it was, but it was enough that it caught their attention. Okay. Long story short, they rule him out. Okay. But it's important. We're going to come back to them talking to all of the people that were out at Nancy's property.
And being able to eliminate as many people as possible through a thorough investigation.
Right. Now, San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office is the investigating agency, and a few of their detectives have heard about this new technology for law enforcement called a Google Geofence. And they thought, why not? We don't have any other leads. We have nothing to lose here. So they consult with a handful of different agencies, a couple attorneys. They write the search warrant. They use our template. I don't know how our template got to them. They didn't get it from us, but it was passed through. So I've seen the template. It's a solid search warrant. They're going to get the results back. But the first time you get results back on a Google Geofence, It's confusing.
Very confusing. And Google Geofences were really new and novel, and everybody was trying to figure them out and what the data meant and how far that data extended. It was a big deal. It was an exciting time.
Yeah, and they went with a pretty big area. So a geofence is where I put a shape on a map defined by latitude and longitude, like a box or a rectangle. Mm-hmm. And then I write my search warrant and I tell Google, any device that had location information that you're storing in your database between this time and this time that falls within this shape, I want it.
And you can make the shape almost any size. And as a best practice, you wanted to make it fit only over your crime scene area where devices could have been.
Yeah, you want to be careful getting too big. It's there, and there's a lot of arguments back and forth, and this has gone both sides as far as you can to way too big and way too small. Theirs is probably a hair too big, and I'll show it here in just a minute. Mm-hmm. Now, once they get the results back, though, remember, we have 20 people that are staying on the property that night, and we have neighbors, and she's not too far from a main road that gets quite a bit of traffic. So when they start looking at this data, there's a ton of devices there. How you figure out which one of those devices potentially is related to this crime where the arrests aren't is very difficult to do.
Well, and also, I think for them, they don't know what the accuracies and inaccuracies of Google data could have been, or how much location information you're actually going to get within a certain amount of time. So I think extending that parameter a little bit in their minds was probably a safer thing to do at that point in time, without realizing the ramifications of what that could potentially create later on.
Yeah, the primary detective, and I think it was maybe late September, early October that year, is going to go to a class in San Diego on cell phone technology. And on Wednesday of that class, the instructor is presenting Google Geofences. So the lead detective is sitting there and he's seeing all this stuff and he's thinking, oh, that's how you process Google data.
You were the instructor, right?
I was the instructor. Okay. On a break, he asked me, hey, we have this case. We haven't solved it. We have Google data, but we couldn't get anything out of the Google data. Would you mind looking at it?
How are they trying to look at it?
Through Excel.
Oh, yeah.
So I mapped it really quick. And I said, yeah, you've got to look at this in map. You've got to move it through time and space. That's the only way you can analyze this stuff.
It has to be dynamic.
Yes. And I mapped it. And I'm going to actually show this so people see. I don't want people thinking all of a sudden, well, that's because you just know how. It's not that. Anybody who looks at this data once it's properly mapped can come to the same conclusion that I did. So when I say the next thing, I want people to understand that it's not that I'm doing something super secret. It's the methodology that I'm using. And I want people to see that it took me about 5 minutes. And I looked at it and I said, well, that's your device.
Right.
So I did find a single device. So before I map it, I want to show what it looks like in Excel. And it's a pretty straightforward data set. So what we're looking at here is in that first column, we have a device ID. And this is important. This is an anonymized number from Google.
So you can't tell exactly who that device belongs to. It's just a random number.
It's just a random number. And the only database in the entire world that can take that number and get it back to an account like within Google account. Is Google. And you have to have a search warrant to do it. So it's important to understand when I first get this, because I know a lot of people are like, oh, they're looking at me. Law enforcement doesn't know who they're looking at when they first get these reports. All we're seeing is this randomized, anonymized number. Then we get the date and time that you can see there with the timestamp, the latitude and longitude, which is pretty straightforward. The source is what Google is using to pinpoint the location. And it's either GPS, Wi-Fi, or cell sites. And all of them have different accuracy ranges that we have to deal with. And that's what that map display column there is, where you see like 10, 16, 50. Those are meters.
I think this also confuses a lot of the general public of whose data between all of the providers, all of the technology companies that are out there. I think they get confused on different types of accuracy between GPS, Wi-Fi, and cellular, because they're all a little different.
Yeah, 100%.
Some are far more accurate with GPS. Some aren't as accurate at all.
Yeah, when I'm working with these reports, anything that is related to cell tower data from Google, we throw out. They do not do a good job with this. It is severely inaccurate. So when I'm mapping this, I just rely on Wi-Fi or GPS. So today I want to actually use Google Earth on the episode instead of using a little prepared animation. So our viewers can actually see what it is that we're looking at and how we do it. So you see a bunch of red circles. If we zoom way in, you can actually see these red dots. Those red dots are the actual latitude, longitude. And then this radius, this black circle around these red dots, that's the range. So Google is giving us the latitude and longitude. But then when we open up these little boxes, we can see the date time. It's a Wi-Fi connection. And this one is, I think, 16 meters. So that red circle that's around this little dot is at 16 meters. And if I pick any point in time, you can see we're actually getting a lot of different devices. And I have a little timeline slider up here.
Are all of your devices in red right now?
Everything is in red because we don't separate that because it's just the initial.
It's all anonymized.
Right.
Okay.
And as I move this timeline slider up at the front, you can actually see all of the different devices registering on the map over time. So when I first said this can be very confusing if you don't know what you're looking at, like how do you know which one of these is potentially a suspect or a neighbor or one of the wedding party? Mm-hmm. There's a couple things I want to show here that's really neat to see that Google does because Google has Google Maps. Anytime you're in navigation mode, we will actually see to 3-meter accuracy the exact path you're taking. So as I highlight this here and I'm going to move it back and forth, we can actually see one of the wedding party returning to the house using Google Maps.
And you can go into your Google location history if you have your location on, and you can look at your own previous routes of where you've been. I actually like to do that when we're traveling to different countries. If there is a restaurant that I liked, I'll go back in my Google history to recall how we got to that particular restaurant or bar or whatever it is that we wanted to get back to and we can't remember where it was.
Okay, I highlighted something on the screen right here that I want to talk about just a little bit. And what we're seeing is a vehicle that is using Google Maps. It's in navigation mode and it drives by the house. It enters the geofence up here at the top of the screen. It drives south along this road right next to Nancy's house. And then when it gets down here, it turns to the west and then it goes outside of the geofence. So earlier when I said they draw a shape, they drew a rectangle on this map. And then Google is giving them any location data that's falling within that rectangle for a 12-hour period, which is during the time that they believe Nancy was killed. This is kind of a problem. And I want to point this out from the beginning. We are now getting location data on an individual who's driving past the house who most likely had nothing to do with this crime. And in most geofence warrants, we will see something like this. But we have a search warrant. We have a search warrant authorizing us to look at this. So that's always been the justification. We'll come back to that at the end of this episode.
However, that person's identity is anonymized.
No idea who it is. Now, the argument could be if they would have pulled into one of these houses, maybe it's a neighbor. Right? So there are ways that we can possibly look at. I'm going to hit a play button here for a minute. And what we're going to look at is the activity just over Nancy's house here. And when we look at this, this is what I did in class to actually show the detectives what I wanted to see. And you see all these red dots that are coming up over the main house. The neighbor is very active. So you'll see some of the lighter red shading that's going to pop off to the south there. But most of the actual GPS locations we see on this property are on the main house. Yeah. But if we look very carefully, we're coming up right here. You're going to see a hit that's going to pop up on the guest house. And then after that, right there.
Right over
right next to Nancy's bedroom.
Yes.
And about 20 minutes later, we're going to get another one. Right there.
Oh, and it's a really small hit.
Both of them are 10-meter hits. So I'll kind of back this up so we can zoom in and look at it. This is all I did. So when I say I loaded the data, I mapped the data and I loaded it. This is what I did in class. And just like we did here, it took me maybe 5 minutes. Right. And I'm able to click on this and say, this is concerning because it's a 10-meter hit and it's GPS. It's not Wi-Fi. Right. Google GPS data is extremely accurate. This is a device that was either in the house or right in the front yard of that house. There's no doubt about it.
And what time was that?
The first one was at roughly like 1:30. The second one is at 1:52. They're about 20 minutes apart.
In the morning.
In the morning. So.
And her 911 call was at 12:17.
12:17. So this is an hour and a half after the 911 call. More importantly, now that we've identified this device, I can take that device ID and I can say, okay, well, we have 12 hours worth of time. Maybe it's somebody in the wedding party. Have we ever seen this device on the property before 6 hours prior to this or 6 hours after this? And we don't. The only time we ever see this device on the property during this 12-hour window that covering the nighttime period when something happens to Nancy is at 1:30 and 1:50 roughly.
Okay.
This is your suspect.
You mentioned 12 hours. Explain why you limit your time frames to determine if somebody has ever been on the property within a framed limit of time.
Yeah, so basically the way that these warrants work is there's 3 steps. Step 1, I identify this shape or space on the map, and I can only see devices that are operating in that space during the timeline. In this case, it's 12 hours. Now that I can articulate this device is very interesting to me, I believe that this is our device, I can go back to Google and I can get all of that device's history within that 12-hour window outside of the geofence. So I can look a little bit further.
But you would have to do that with a second search warrant.
Or I include that verbiage in the first search warrant. So depending on which version they're running with, the first search warrant allows me.
It's a bit of a dual factor authentication.
It is. Best practices, we encourage people to write an entirely different search warrant because you want to articulate to a judge, we found this device and this is why this device is important. Here's what we're seeing that's justifying the probable cause to get more data. And ultimately, in this case, we're going to get 5 months of this location data on this device, and we're going to see an incredible amount of information. So just to recap here, to your point earlier, we had the 911 call at 12:17. The first little ping we see at the house there is at 1:33. The second one is at 1:52. We don't see any more after that. Both of them are 10-meter GPS hits, which is very reliable. So it's looking pretty good here.
Okay.
Now, we talked earlier in the episode about expectation of privacy. And I'm sure people are probably thinking, okay, well, there is an expectation of privacy of people's location data.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there's also an argument to be made. The suspect in this case, which is who we're targeting now, does not have an expectation of privacy of his location's device while he's inside the crime scene killing somebody.
Right. Right, which is why it was obtained with a search warrant.
Correct. And even if he wants to argue later on, no, it's outside this premise or whatever, he doesn't have standing to argue his expectation of privacy because he's in a house illegally committing a crime while he's arguing at the same time, I should have had an expectation of privacy. So I want people to understand that is not what we're talking about when we are getting into this conversation. It has nothing to do with the defendant's expectation of privacy. It's a really important topic there. And we talked about the anonymized IDs. This is where the second phase of this process, I can take that anonymized ID back to Google, and now I can get the Gmail account that's associated with it. And this is where it opens up everything, all location history, Gmail information, search history. It just opens this plethora of other data.
With the second search warrant.
Correct. So law enforcement's going to do just that. They're going to take this anonymized ID. They write a second search warrant. They're going to now convert that anonymized ID to a Gmail address. And this suspect's going to make it really easy because he actually uses part of his name as his Gmail address. This is Carlo Alberto Fuentes Flores. Carlo's 42 years of age at this time. He was contacted early in the investigation, but overlooked. He's a painter. He was working for the contractor that they thought had some issues. Mm-hmm. So law enforcement actually contacted Carlo to get his opinion about this contractor's relationship with Nancy. Oh. And he's like, I didn't see anything. I was just a painter. I just painted the house.
But he's a pretty angry guy. It's probably him.
Yeah, right. So it's documented early on. He was doing work for Nancy at this time. He's been out the house at several times, but there was really no reason to suspect him. Now, it's important to understand, all we've done on the Google Geofence is we've put a device that is associated with him inside the crime scene at the time of the crime. We haven't put him in the crime scene. And this is a really important element. There's a case, we'll talk about it here in a little bit. You can't just take this Google data and now assume, oh, it's this person's Gmail address, they committed the crime, right? It requires more investigation.
Well, he could have left his phone behind at some point and somebody found it and turned it on, and now we're seeing those hits pop up.
Somebody could have stolen it.
Yeah.
A family member could have had it. Mm-hmm. There's just a number of things. The other thing that people need to understand with a Gmail address is any Android device, so a Samsung phone, a Samsung tablet, any Android device requires a Gmail to actually function. So I could have my single Gmail associated to 8 different devices. Maybe my kids have it. Maybe my wife has it.
It's what makes the operating system functional.
Yes. So there's a lot of work we still have to do to say, okay, we know it's his device that's in the house. We need to connect him to the device at that time.
Right.
Now, in this case, we have suspect DNA. So they're going to do a DNA comparison. Now, they don't want to contact Carlo yet, so they're going to do this through surveillance. And they see him at a restaurant. He's drinking out of a Coke bottle. He leaves the Coke bottle behind. They're going to seize the Coke bottle, swab it for DNA, match it to the crime scene DNA, and boom, now they know, okay, it's Carlo's DNA that we have at the house.
Okay, great.
Some important factors that are coming up here. December 18th is where we're at on our timeline. So if you remember, this happened May 4th, May 5th. We're now up to December 18th. Law enforcement's going to call him on the phone. They're doing surveillance on him at the same time, so they're actually watching him. But they're going to call him on the phone, and they're going to ask him to come in for an interview, and he agrees. He drives to the station. The surveillance team follows him just to make sure he goes. He's going to admit right up front, yeah, I was working at the house. I already told you guys this. She was really, really nice to me, though. At lunch, she brought me tamales, and she asked me to sit down with her and have lunch with her. And she was really talkative. And she was talking about her church and her religion, and she wanted me to come to church with her. She was very flirtatious.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, and that's because men are dumb. She wasn't being flirtive at all. She was trying to convert him to become a Jehovah's Witness. And he took it, let's just say he misread it a little bit.
Very sexy.
Yeah, apparently. He's going to deny right from the get-go, though. Whoa. I had nothing to do with her disappearance. I had nothing to do with any of this. So obviously he doesn't admit it right up front. One of the detectives tells him at one point, hey, Carlo, you're here because we know things, not because we think things.
Okay.
And he's like, yeah, okay, so here's the story. I left a ladder over there. And around midnight, I remembered, and I needed the ladder for the next day. So I drove over there to get the ladder. When I pulled into her driveway, it was really dark, and she was walking across the driveway. I didn't see her, and I ran her over.
Oh, dear.
And then I realized, oh my God, I killed her. So I took her out, and I just dumped the body and got my ladder and left.
That statement doesn't qualify any of the evidence
That's one of the
found.
dumbest confessions I think I've ever heard from a suspect. And the detectives are like, Carlo, that doesn't match anything that we're seeing. Like, no, that's not how it happened.
Actually tell him that?
Yeah, like that's just dumb. Stop. What really happened?
Stop being less than truthful.
But he does admit to hiding the body at that point. So they jump on that part first, and they do a great job in this interview. I've got to give it to these detectives. They are on the ball because they get him talking about where he dumped her.
Okay.
So they immediately, before they get any more confrontational, hey, Carlo, at the end of the day, family just wants to bury her. They want to put this behind. They want to give her a peaceful burying.
They want closure.
Right. They want some type of closure here. Can you take us to the body? Oh, sure. So they all jump in the car, and off they go. On the way out to these grasslands, and it's probably about a 30-mile drive from where her house is. On the way out there, he actually starts almost bragging about how he took his time to outline her body in rocks. So there's this rock circle that goes around her body, and then he stacked tumbleweeds very carefully over the top of her. He didn't bury her. He just kind of stacked these tumbleweeds and made this little rock monument.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, kind of just weird behavior. And
that is weird.
They couldn't put their finger on why is he telling us this. What really piqued their interest is how much pride he was exhibiting while he's explaining he made this little circular rock monument.
I wonder if he, in his head, thought something along the lines of it was the right thing to do after what he did to her.
Yeah, I don't know. Just really
give her
weird,
a nice
right?
Burial or take care of her in some way.
Yeah. This is a picture of the crime scene, and obviously you can't see anything here. Keep in mind, we're 6 months after he dumped her body out in the exposed elements, not buried.
So you're going to have animal activity.
A lot of animal
weather
activity.
And,
yeah. There's a female kind of standing close to the center of the screen in a brown jacket. She's holding a camera in her right hand. She is at the gravesite. She's taking pictures there. All they're going to recover is the skull and a handful of bones. Most of Nancy's body is gone at this point.
Right.
And what is there is just a few bones. So they do DNA. They do confirm this is Nancy. They've recovered her. So Carlo's legit on that part because he takes him right to the body.
Was there anything there that they could also find his DNA again, or he just left no trace behind?
Yeah, nothing is going to be... The body is in such a state of decomp at that point. We're literally just looking at bones. We're not going to get any forensic value out of anything here. So no DNA, there's not going to be any evidence on how he killed her at this point either. Yeah. There's nothing obvious with the bones that they do recover. Mm-hmm. Now, he's still talkative. So after they recover the body, they take him back to the station and they do a second interview. I should go back a little bit here. They did read him Miranda in the beginning.
Okay.
They read him Miranda again when they come back from the body.
Okay.
And this time he's going to change his story. He did go to the house with the intent to rape her. He thought she was coming on to him when she was trying to convert him to become a Jehovah's Witness. Because there's nothing sexier than a female trying to get you to become a Jehovah's Witness.
And tamales.
Tamales is a different story. I can see the tamales, but this is his thinking. And I think it goes into that criminal mind of just how far someone can go to try to justify their act, right?
Right. And then make themselves feel better about it afterwards.
Because she wanted it, clearly.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really just, this is where things start to get really disturbing for me. When he goes over there, he finds her sliding glass door was unlocked. So she didn't lock her door. He just opened the door and went in. She hears him and actually comes out of her bedroom and there's a fight. The immediate fight, and he punches her in the nose. She's bleeding really bad. He tells detectives at that point he knew he had to kill her because she would report him and he didn't want to go to jail. So he smothers her, they believe, with that pillow. And she's bleeding from her nosebleed. So that's where all the blood is coming from. And he's holding that pillow down over her head, which is why the handprint there.
Oh my gosh.
Where things get more disturbing is he also admits to raping her.
Okay, prior.
But in his order of operation, he kills her first. And the detectives catch this and they're like, hang on. Are you saying you raped her after you killed her? And I think this is the first time he really starts to get a little bit freaked out of realizing what it sounds like to explain what he did. So this is where he's going to stop providing all of these specific details. The part that's going to come up, though, that's really concerning is he admits to being in the house for almost 4 hours. In that 4-hour period, because she was calling 911, he attacks her and kills her very quickly. So probably within the first 10 or 15 minutes, she's deceased. Right. And he's going to linger about for more than 3 hours after that.
What is he doing in that time?
Yeah, this is that disturbing part of it, right?
Oh.
He's still cooperative. He just won't get into any other details. So again, these detectives are doing a great job. They ask him to write an apology letter to the family so that they can go back to the family and say, hey, he's really remorseful. Here's what happened. And he agrees. So he writes a full confession in the form of an apology letter. Consensual.
Wow.
Yeah, they are going to start doing a deep dive into his background. Obviously, they have his Google history. They're looking at his search history. They seize his phone. They're going to do a physical extract to look at all the data on his phone. He is really into older female porn, like cougar porn.
Oh. I didn't realize cougar porn was a thing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, cougar porn.
Cougar porn. Ooh. I saw a lady the other night. She was a little older at a restaurant. She had like a cougar tattooed.
Oh, yeah. I told you. I was like, look, she's on the prowl. And you're like, that's not what that means. And I'm like, why would an older lady have a giant cougar on her shoulder?
Well, I guess I wouldn't imagine an older woman would go and just advertise this on themselves. I don't know. It just seems weird to me.
It looked like a billboard to me. But anyway.
Would you have gone to her marketing campaign?
God, no. Stop it.
Okay.
Have you seen the beautiful women I hang out with?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
You're right.
Okay. Anyway, back to our story. He also had a history of affairs. So he is married. He has a daughter, but there's a very clear history of him having affairs. There's pictures. There's some videos on his phone of some of his affair activity. We also have 5 months of his Google locations showing trips that he's taking, specifically down to Mexico, to meet up with his mistress.
So he goes from Paso Robles down to Mexico to meet up with a mistress?
At least once. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And remember, I'm only looking at 5 months. I don't know what's happened in the last 5 years.
Right.
The other reason we're doing this deep dive into his Google history, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's very rare for an individual to progress to this level of violence where they break into somebody's house with the intent to rape a lady, kill her almost immediately, apparently still sexually assaults her for hours after she's deceased, dumps the body, and he is in the free and clear. He has gotten away with this at this point.
And it's his first time.
Right. And if it was his first time, what has he done since then? Right.
Right, yeah.
So there's this really big deep dive into the data to see, can we find any other victims by any chance? So there's a couple trips to Phoenix that he took, and I know that they worked with Phoenix detectives to say, hey, on these dates, these times when he's in town, do you guys have any missing women? Do you have any reports? Right. Okay. Nothing is found. And he insists this is his one and only time. But we really get into that Google data specifically for that.
Okay.
Now, when we look at May 4th, the day of the homicide or the day preceding the homicide, it tells a very clear story. He went golfing with a buddy, so you can actually see him hit all 18 holes in his Google data, tracks him perfectly through the golf course. Mm-hmm. When they get done golfing, him and his buddy go to his buddy's business, have a couple drinks. It's closed, so they're just drinking in the warehouse area.
Okay.
After that, they go to the buddy's house. They continue drinking. And they're going to be able to interview this guy who's going to corroborate all of this information. Just before midnight, he leaves his buddy's house and he goes to a church parking lot. And he parks in the church parking lot for about 20 minutes.
Little pre-confession time?
I don't know what the hell he's doing, but it is weird that, and Google is very specific with their data. It's not like, oh, we think he's in this part of town. Mm-hmm. We can see he's parked in the parking lot in front of this church. And he's there for, I think it's 18 minutes total.
Did he ever talk about that?
Never. He never mentioned it. And then he's going to drive from that church straight to Nancy's house. We have great Google data on him all day. We see constant pings. His phone is very chatty. So we see these constant pings. As he's approaching the house, phone goes off. And the phone is off until 1:30 in the morning. It's going to come back on for 20 minutes. We get those 2 GPS hits, back off. The phone will not come back on until the next morning. Mm-hmm. So there's something to consider here too. After being at the house for a little bit over an hour, he takes the time to turn his phone back on. So you have to ask why. Well, we know he has pictures and videos of his affair. I think he might have taken pictures or videos of something that he was doing on the house, because when you turn on a Samsung phone and you use the camera app, it does ping GPS data because it tries to geocode those pictures.
Did they do a forensic extract of the phone?
They did. There was nothing on the phone of Nancy's, but that doesn't mean he couldn't have deleted that before. There are ways you can delete that and get it completely out where some types of forensic extracts will not detect it.
Sure.
The behavior is consistent with camera use. So it's kind of interesting. It's also consistent with flashlight use. A lot of people don't realize the reason you get the free flashlight app is that there's a company who's trying to track location data on you. So anytime you turn your flashlight on, it actually turns on your GPS as well. Yeah. So there's a couple of different things he could have done, but it's interesting to me that he does turn the phone back on while he's at the house. And it's the only thing that saves this case. I don't think he would have been caught to this day without that.
And then turns it off with the intent to take her body so that somewhere where he couldn't be tracked to.
Correct. And he leaves it off till the next morning. One interesting note there, when he turns it back on the next morning, he's actually going to a car wash. So he's cleaning his truck the next morning.
Oh, and his family, his wife, his daughter didn't get caught on to this?
In fact, I think he took his daughter to school the next morning. He takes the daughter to school, drops her off at school, then goes to the car wash.
And the daughter didn't say if she saw anything suspicious in the car?
Nope. Wife and daughter have no idea anything's going on. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I want to take just a moment and show our socialites what some of the work product looks like that we take into court, and kind of that level that we expect on a case like this of what you should see in court to actually be able to prove the things we're talking about.
And allow the jury to understand big data sets in a common sense way that is visually understandable.
Right. So he has a daily pattern, and the daily pattern is helpful, but it's not, we're not going to go through 5 months of his daily pattern. So we're just looking at significant events over time. So we make this little timeline, and what I can do with this is I can click this little button that says timeline, and now I can go month by month. So you see up in the top right corner, I've got the 5 months that we've mapped, and I can click on any one of those maps. So let's say for some reason I want to look at March. Like, what did he do in the month of March? Mm-hmm. I can click on this and I can see certain dates of importance of where he was at in March, or I can go to January, or I can go to February. So I mentioned earlier the Mexico trip. That was on February 9th. What this now allows me to do is, as we're explaining this case to the jury, we can either go in chronological order, or maybe somebody has a specific question about the Mexico trip. I can now click on this Mexico trip, and I'm going to play the data automatically that's associated with that particular time period. And what's going to happen is we're going to start at Carlos' house, where his GPS is pinging at his house that morning, and we're going to see him drive all the way down to Mexico, and there is absolutely no doubt the exact route that he took.
Right.
What's interesting is as he gets closer to the border, coming out of the LA area, driving down to San Diego, he puts his phone into navigation mode. So we start to get these beautiful 3-meter hits. When he crosses the border, this data is so accurate, we can see which lane he's in to do the border crossing. And obviously they have license plate readers as you go across the border. This opens up all kinds of other avenues that we can now go corroborate this data and say, okay, hey, on this date, this time, he was in lane number 7. We believe he was driving this truck. Hey, border crossing station, do you have record of it? Yes, we have record. Once he crosses, he goes to the airport. We believe, or I believe, this is where he's picking up his mistress who's flying into the airport. Oh. And he's not going to waste any time. As soon as he picks her up from the airport, straight to the hotel. And Google data is so accurate, even in Mexico, we can see where he parked in the parking lot of the Fiesta Inn motel that he stays at. They're going to stay at
a
little party at the Fiesta. He's going to stay there for the majority of the afternoon. This is Tijuana, by the way. The next day, they're going to do some shopping because, there's nothing like shopping in Tijuana.
Picking up a handful of prescriptions, some penicillin.
Right. So here's where he literally parks in the parking lot. They take a little day trip the next day. You kind of get the idea. At any time, I can jump back into our timeline.
This dude's poor wife and daughter.
Yeah, especially now, right?
Yeah.
And then we can get into the actual day of the trip. And I'm sure all of our socialites have heard me talk about speed route analysis all the time, right? This is how we start to corroborate location. This is him driving to Nancy's house that night. And what I'm showing is when we look at these pings that Google is giving us and we look at the time and the distance that are created, it's accurate. Just like the penny case we did last week, a penny for your thoughts.
Sure.
Very similar here, where we can actually start to see speeds and we can corroborate the accuracy of this data.
Within that 5-month time frame, were you able to see how many times he had been at Nancy's house prior to the homicide?
We have. So that's another thing that we put together here is you'll see a tab that says common locations. And what I'm looking at here is I'm trying to find patterns within his records where we see regular activity on a regular basis. And the reason for that is it makes it easy for me to tie that pattern of life to a person. So I've got a couple of different addresses here. When he's home, I can see all the times he's home, and that matches what we see in other records, like his phone records of when he's home. The elementary school his daughter went to, he prolifically was the one who dropped off daughter every morning. Okay. So we can see his trip to school every morning. The self-storage here, this is where he stored all of his painting materials. So before jobs, he would go to the self-storage. And then the El Faro address is Nancy's address. So yeah, we can get into here and we can specifically look at how many times do we see trips or pings that are in that area. So the first time he was ever there was April 25th. Then April 26th, April 27th, April 30th. He was there on the 2nd of May, the 3rd of May. And then you see the 2 hits on the 5th. On the 8th, he goes back. After the murder, he still has his ladder and some of his materials at the job site. So he goes back and gets some of his materials. The other important thing of why these patterns of life and looking at these patterns are important is I now have control samples of what it looks like when we know he's there painting, how he got there, how he left, and it matches the same travel route that he took that night when he actually went there to rape her. So it all works out. It's all consistent, but just a really quick insight so that our socialites get a kind of an idea of what the work product looks like when we start presenting these cases. It's not just somebody on the stand saying, oh, he was there, right? We put a lot of effort into showing this history and then showing the exact routes.
Right. Well, and I think also for our socialites, they've heard so much about cellular location information. I think it's good to give them other types of data to look at that law enforcement can use to determine location information as well.
Yes, 100%. And now we're going to do full circle here, start dropping some bombs and some scary stuff. They are going to convict him of this. And actually, he's going to take a plea deal, but he is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, anytime somebody gets sentenced to life in prison, no possibility of parole, it's an automatic appeal. So there will be an appeal filed. They're struggling here. They're going to say it wasn't a consensual interview. Even though they read him Miranda twice and he wrote a confession letter.
That's hard to say it isn't consensual.
Yeah, that's not going to fly. The other thing, and it made me chuckle a little bit when I read it, is Detective Cole is the primary detective And for whatever reason, they're like, oh, we don't like this Detective Cole guy. Hey, you guys should look at his personnel file as part of an appeal.
Well, they had nothing, and they have to appeal something.
Yeah. And you could tell how desperate it was. They're just searching for anything in this case. Obviously, that's going to get turned down. He's not going anywhere. And I don't want to lose the impact of this case. This is a sad case. Nancy is this widow. She's doing fairly well for herself.
She's a good person.
She's got back on her feet since her husband's death. She's thriving in the community. She's in her own bed, right? She is at home in her area of safety and security, if you will, when somebody enters her house with the intent to rape and kill her. And I don't want anything we're saying today to get lost on that. This case is solved by Google Geofence. I think Carlo would still be on the loose today because remember, we couldn't put his DNA in CODIS.
Right.
Even if later on there was a DNA match in CODIS, it wouldn't come back to necessarily this crime scene. And that's a scary thought for me to think, man, if we lost Google Geofences or we're not able to do them, Nancy's murder today would still be unsolved.
And how many people would he have done the same thing to over time after that because he got away with it?
Right. So that's where I want to come full circle now. And let's go back to the Fifth Court of Appeals and this whole new thing where they're coming out saying Google Geofences are inherently unconstitutional. You can't do it.
Yeah, I'm curious as to their...
Yeah, and my knee jerk was like, it's a crappy decision. It'll be overruled. We just need it to go to the next stage. It's fine. It's going to be a temporary thing. And then I started getting into the case. And then I had started getting into the case more. And then I started making phone calls to people. And then we started having debates. Then you and I stay up late at night, which we don't do. Debating even further.
We did stay up pretty late.
I think we got to the point where you finally said, I don't want to play anymore. I just want to go to bed.
Yeah.
So let me get to the crutch of the argument. They believe these are general warrants. And I know most of our socialites aren't going to understand necessarily what a general warrant is. So let me explain. We're going back to colonial days. Almost 300 years ago,
right?
1760s. And basically what was happening is British law had a writ of assistance or a general warrant. And what this allowed was I could get a warrant that allowed me to search any person or any place that is possibly related to this crime. And typically the crime was some type of smuggling, avoiding to pay like a cargo tax.
Right.
And it was allowing British soldiers to employ local law enforcement to search any house they want. So they could go into a neighborhood and say, okay, we're searching that house, and that house.
It was a blanket warrant.
Yes. And if we found something, great. If we didn't find anything, no harm, no foul. They would just move on. And obviously they were pretty brutal back in those days. Mm-hmm. Well, this really pissed the colonials off. This is the reason we have 4th of July now. This is the core reason that started the American Revolution.
What also created our 4th Amendment rights as we know them today.
Yeah. So I want to take just a moment because it's really important for people to understand some American history here. Because for me, I was having a hard time wrapping my head around this decision, and I'm thinking, this is crap. But then as soon as I got a little bit into the history, I'm like, this is literally the cornerstone of our Constitution. So I'm having a hard time now getting past that. The Fifth Circuit might be onto something. So I want to talk about James Otis. Really smart dude, went to Harvard. So we talked about these writs of assistance or general warrants. James Otis was an attorney. So when he went to Harvard, he actually was practicing law. And he was practicing law in Massachusetts. Well, he ended up suing the British government for these types of warrants, these general warrants. And a lot of people don't realize they know this guy because he makes this really profound opening statement where he says, every home is a castle. And this is the castle doctrine.
Yeah.
And this was the big first argument by the colonials that, hey, our houses are private to us. You can't just randomly conduct these searches. And this is what becomes known as the castle doctrine.
You can't randomly conduct searches by casting such a wide net to find anything you can on anyone there.
Right. It's a general warrant. It's not a specific warrant, and they're unconstitutional. Well, he sues the British government and takes this lawsuit before the British courts. He loses. It's the British courts.
Right. Go back over the pond, buddy.
But he's recognized by a lot of thought leaders of that time period as this guy's got the right mindset to go where we need to go. A few years later, the whole Boston Tea Party results as a part of the Tax Stamp Act. Mm-hmm. Well, he's going to be a major player in those early days of being very outspoken against the stamp tax. Okay. Which is very important because he's one of the delegates that gets sent to New York when they do the first real congressional meeting, if you will.
Sure.
He is a major player in what's going to become the American Revolution. So I need people to understand when they first defined these general warrants, this is the emotional tie that drove the colonials to saying, we're going to fight for these rights.
Sure.
He has a sad demise, though. In 1769, he's hanging out in a bar, gets in a little bit of an argument with a tax collector, go figure. This tax collector clubs him over the head.
Oh, dear.
It appears that he may have already had some mental health issues going on, just very slight ones.
The tax collector or James Otis?
James Otis.
Okay.
And this does him in. He is completely insane at this point. Like, he just has very few lucid moments at all. A few years later, he gets struck by lightning, kills him.
Oh,
so
that's too bad.
Prior to his clubbing in the bar, he was a very profound leader that would lead to the American Revolution. Obviously, American Revolution happens. The wig wearers sit down to write our Constitution. They remember this. And, you know, if you look at the priorities that they listed, they went in order, 1, 2, 3, 4. This was number 4. And the reason the Fourth Amendment exists today is because they say you cannot search people's homes with these general warrants. And there's a couple elements that they put into this process that get defined over the years. For me to write a search warrant, I have to target a person. I have to identify the place that the evidence is at. I have to identify what the evidence is. And I have to have probable cause to say, I know that evidence is there.
Sure.
Right? Back to the Fifth Court of Appeals. And it's going to come down to what a search is. You and I debated about this for a long time.
It's tough because in the 1700s, they had no idea what technology could do. They had no idea of programming and third-party companies that would do such things to offer this information to law enforcement.
Okay, this is going to be a test question, Socialites, so listen up. This is going to be part of our survey that we're going to put on our community tab here. Is this a search or is this not a search? And before we get into that, I want to explain a term I'm going to use called a filter. And anybody who's ever used Excel, and even if you haven't used Excel, I'm going to explain it in a manner that's going to make sense. You run a small business. You've had that small business for 15 years. All of your cells, all of your invoices are in an Excel spreadsheet. You want to go back and look at all of the invoices you've ever created between $500 and $1,000. Okay, now you can manually go line by line, pull them out, and you could calculate that.
But hopefully you're proficient in Excel.
And if you're proficient in Excel, Excel has a feature called filters. And I can go to the column that has the dollar amount and I can set a filter to say, hey, Excel, just show me the invoices between 500 and 1,000. So where I started off with maybe 20,000 invoices, I put this filter in and now I've got 6 invoices, right? I don't have to manually do it. So that's a filter. Filters are programmatic.
Yes.
Is using a filter a search?
I don't think it's the same as an invasive search of going to someone's home and searching through their drawers.
Right. And I would agree with you, except times are changing. Second question that we're going to put on our little survey. So hear me out through this, Socialites, because this one's really important to wrap your head around.
I do think there's a big difference between a filter and a search.
Well, hang on.
Okay.
We're on to the next question. You can fill out the survey when we're done.
This is where I go back and forth. Okay.
If I told you I'm either going to search your house or I'm going to search all of your data that you have in any cloud storage, so any location data through the phone carriers, your photos that you maybe have in your Google Photos, I can either search your house or I can search all of the digital data you have in some type of a cloud. Which would you feel more subjected to your privacy being violated, your house or your digital data?
Oh, just don't look at the pictures on my phone.
See, your digital data. Our kids said the same thing. Oh, wait, you're going to look at my pictures? Search my house. And I'm like, oh, shit. Right. But in 2024.
Actually, she didn't even care what was looked at on her phone either. Just don't look at her pictures, she said.
Right. In 2024, what has dramatically changed is I have more things that are private to me in cloud servers than I do in my house.
Well, you don't keep financial records very often anymore in your home in a file drawer, right? All of your financials, your medical history, your sexual activity, everything is kept in your device.
Right. It's a treasure trove.
It is.
So What the Fifth Circuit is looking at here is, if you believe in the castle doctrine, which I do, my home is my castle, you should have to have a search warrant to search it. And not only should you have to have a search warrant, you have to explain what it is in that house that you're looking for, and probable cause that you know it exists there. Well, the Fifth Circuit is saying in the digital age in 2024, there's just as much private stuff held by third-party companies in these clouds as there is in your house.
Right, which I think was established very well in Carpenter and Jones. I think the
Carpenter
Supreme
being the
Court,
landmark case on it,
yes,
for sure.
did a very good job establishing what kind of evidence is on people's devices, the privacy that people hold within those devices, and just by turning that over to a third-party company, they almost have an expectation that that company will maintain their privacy with it.
And it's one thing for Google to look at your location data and guide some marketing advertisements to you. It's another thing for the government to seize that data and use it against you, right? There's a clear distinction there. And I think people are probably way more comfortable with Google having their location data than the US government.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Especially if it's not obtained via search warrant.
Right. So that's the second question, is socialites. Which one is a bigger impact to your privacy? Somebody searching your house or somebody searching through all of the digital data that is stored by third-party companies with your financial institution, your cell phone carrier, Google search history, those type of things? I'm really curious what they say. Now, let me tie all this together. What the Fifth Circuit is saying, if I want to search Google with a geofence, I'm not targeting a specific person, because I don't know who I'm looking for.
Right.
So what I'm doing is I'm sending Google a filter. And I'm saying, Google, you have, by the way, it's 592 million accounts. You have billions of location points in these 592 million accounts. I'm giving you a search warrant where I want you to use a filter to search through all of those 592 accounts and show me which ones are pinging inside of my filter.
Correct.
The Fifth Court of Appeals is saying that's a search. And it's not just a search for a suspect's data, it's a search for every single account in the 592 million accounts Google holds. And
Which
there is an argument
anonymized.
there. They are anonymized, but it's still a general search. And if I had, and I realize this isn't going to be a direct comparison, but the way the Fifth Circuit is looking at it is saying, we know somewhere in this neighborhood, there's a gun in a nightstand.
It goes back to that general blanket search warrant idea.
So instead of searching one house that you have probable cause to say that gun is in that house, it's a warrant that allows me to search every house in the neighborhood because I know one of them has a gun in the nightstand that I'm looking for.
But at the same time, I think the relevancy of that idea is a little different because of the way programmatically Google does have to search that data to identify and eliminate devices that weren't there and were there. I don't think it constitutes the same type of invasiveness as looking through somebody's underwear drawer or looking through somebody's device for pictures, for content.
This is the third survey question.
Yeah.
Right. And you're hitting it right on the head that I think is really important. So what you're saying is you feel human eyes physically searching through evidence is different than programmatically filtering through data to only produce a certain result.
Yes, because it's a machine that's filtering through it. And I get that that machine is being told to filter that data through an agent that is an extension of law enforcement.
Google.
Yes. But I do feel like the relevancy of the search, so to speak, is different.
Okay, so socialites, that's the next question. Human eyeballs, programmatically, or both? Which one, or do they both, or does one or the other qualify as a search where the other one wouldn't? And what's really interesting with this piece is 10 years ago, I think I would agree with you.
Yeah.
In 2024, seeing some of the things that I've seen with some AI that we're playing around with and phone records and what I can do with AI and location data, I believe the government can be way more intrusive programmatically in using AI to search data than they could ever have been in your house.
And I don't disagree with you. I also believe that there are far more upcoming entrepreneurial companies that can obtain this data, that can use it in other ways, that the government can easily find loopholes to access,
Right.
that the general public wouldn't know about. And they'll oftentimes do that without a search warrant.
Right.
Because there's a loophole.
And we have to be cognizant. This data is not always 100%. I've got a little news clipping here from the Daily Mail, and I'm familiar with this case because it's in Avondale, just on the west side of Phoenix, where a 23-year-old was arrested and charged with murder, held 6 days in jail before they realized it wasn't him. And they identified him through Google GPS on his phone. What they messed up, his dad was using his phone that day. His dad committed the homicide. But they saw it was his phone. The pattern of life looked like it was him, so they just arrested him and they booked him on that. And he was in jail for 6 days before they realized, crap, it was his dad using his phone that day.
So we actually had a socialite ask this question in our comments the other day. They asked, how often, what's the percentage of people that use somebody else's phone to commit a crime?
Yeah, it absolutely happens. So there are flaws in this. But now that we've thrown out a couple of questions, I want to summarize what the Fifth Circuit is saying. A, without targeting a specific individual, just targeting the entire data set is a general warrant. It's the same thing as targeting every house in the neighborhood, right? So that's the first one. The second one, and this one's really important, when law enforcement sends this warrant to Google, they don't know if anything's going to come back or not. And remember, one of the requirements is the warrant is, hey, judge, I'm going to seize this gun. This gun is in Carrie's house. It's in her nightstand. I know that because of X, Y, and Z. I have probable cause to articulate that I know that. I'm going to go serve that search warrant, and I'm going to bring a gun back. Right. When I write a search warrant that says, hey, Your Honor, she might have a gun in the house, and if she does, I'm going to seize it. A judge is not going to approve that warrant because I don't have probable cause to clearly articulate that evidence is there. In these cases, you don't know if you're going to get this data back or not. If he would have had an iPhone, most likely Google wouldn't have any location data on him because it's primarily Android only. Right. So when you're sending these warrants off, you don't have probable cause that anything's going to come back. It falls back into that general warrant status.
And with iPhone, they fall under a different category as it relates to what they do and don't have to give to law enforcement when it comes to location data.
Right. Now, we were arguing a little bit about the filter. Here's the problem. The absolute issue here is the Fifth Circuit is saying if searching through that data with a filter or not with a filter is too ambiguous because we're not identifying a single account, we're attacking the entire data set. Mm-hmm. And we don't know if the evidence we're looking for is in that data set, but we want you to search it anyway. The search warrant itself is flawed. It is a general warrant, and general warrants have been held substantially unconstitutional forever.
And the court can only go by the letter of the law. It would be up to legislators to actually create different laws of how the search warrant has to be written.
Right. And I have a lot of friends in law enforcement. I've been chatting with a lot of them the last several days on this, and all of them feel like, no, it's going to get to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's going to overrule this. I don't know the Supreme Court's going to.
Well, they really can't because they have to go by the letter of the current written law.
The letter of the law supports this. Mm-hmm. And the Fifth Circuit was very clear in calling out where the Fourth Circuit missed it. And usually I can read that and be like, no, you guys missed it. But in this case, I'm like, oh, crap. And I'm the last person in the world who wants to endorse this. I hate this because I think of all of the cases we have solved with similar stuff. And, you know, we're talking about Google Geofences, but this is where this conversation's about to get deep. And I promised our socialites we're going to be dropping some bombs today.
Well, I feel like the Fifth Circuit is really following the letter of the law, where the Fourth Circuit decision kind of goes with the spirit of the law, right? That common sense piece of,
that's not going to hold it.
If we do this properly through search warrants, through a certain search warrant process, then it's common sense in today's age of technology.
But the search warrant process requires a specific person to be named or thing to be searched, and it requires us to have knowledge that we know that evidence is there.
And our judicial system and legislatures are as slow as molasses, so getting any type of new laws on the books are going to take another 25 years.
So Google Geofence data. All right, we might be losing it. Mm-hmm. Tower dumps.
Yes, it does extend to tower dumps.
Exact same thing. We are ordering phone companies to search basically geographical, because we're giving them a cell site, which is typically identified by latitude, longitude. And the reason we're giving them that cell site is because it has somewhat of a known coverage area. We want all the devices in that coverage area.
But again, you're doing a blanket general warrant for an entire coverage area that expands for miles.
And my suspect might be using Verizon, but I sent a tower dump to AT&T.
Right.
I don't even know my suspect is using AT&T.
Right.
And I have been a very staunch supporter of tower dumps my entire career. I've never looked at it with this general warrant conclusion that the Fifth Circuit has brought out.
Well, when you've done tower dumps in the past as well, again, you have a very rigid search warrant process that you look at anonymized numbers.
But the process is irrelevant if the warrant's unconstitutional. I understand that. What I'm
saying is what you've done differently from other agencies that have done tower dumps to maintain anonymized data for people.
I agree.
Is different.
But it would not meet what the Fifth Circuit's requiring here. I've done a lot of cases with search history where, believe it or not, some suspects will actually use Google Maps to get to the crime scene. So we've had success in the past where we've told Google, hey, anybody who Googled this address between these hours, give them to us. That potentially. Financial records. We know a certain thing was used by a suspect and that they obtained that thing on a certain day. The Kayla Brown story with Todd Kohlhepp, the serial killer, we know he was using Amazon quite a bit.
Right.
If they had recovered things at that crime scene and weren't able to connect Todd to anything yet, it's very likely they could have done an Amazon search. Hey, Amazon, give us account information on anybody who's bought these items. And we know he was prolifically using Amazon. So potentially an Amazon search could fall in the same thing. So anything with financial history. And now let me reframe something for you for just a second. Imagine doing the exact same thing without a search warrant.
Oh, that would be such an invasion of privacy.
What if law enforcement had access to databases that did contain personal, private information, and they could search that database, not for the specific thing, but using a filter to return something close to it, and then use that to effect an arrest and to build a case?
Sure. And
I'm going to open the door to this, and I want our socialites to think there's a case called Katz, U.S. versus Katz. It's back from the 60s, and it was a wiretap.
K-A-T-Z.
Yeah, it was a wiretap case, and it's really funny. It's the FBI basically duct taped a recorder to the bottom of a payphone and hit record, and then a bookie came in and used the payphone, and they recorded it. It was one of the first wiretaps that got challenged. And there's a two-pronged test that came out of that case, and this is really important. It's another Socialite survey question. Is if you can determine something is of private, if you have an expectation of privacy to something.
When you go into a phone booth and close the door behind you, Katz had an expectation of privacy in that case.
Right. So that's the first prong is, does the individual who's impacted by it, could they have a reasonable expectation of privacy?
Right.
The second prong is society in general. Do they recognize that expectation of privacy is reasonable? Right. And I think everybody could agree there's a reason there's a phone booth and you close the door. You're in a private, secluded area. And that's what Katz came out. And we're using phone booth to define today's technology. But my question is your DNA private? Do you have a reasonable expectation to your DNA? And I'll tell you, if you look at all the websites that manage in DNA, they all have privacy statements that state to their individuals who are loading DNA into their website, we hold your data private. We will only turn this data over if we have to because we're ordered to by a court. Oh, by the way, you can opt out that this data will never be shared with law enforcement. If a company is putting those on their website, I think we've already hit those two prongs that people have an expectation of privacy and society in general is recognizing.
Especially with their DNA.
Yeah.
It is a very private thing because a lot of people don't use those types of sites just to find a long lost family member.
Right.
A lot of people use those sites to find out family medical history.
Correct.
They want to know if they're prone to something that could potentially kill them soon or what their genetic dispositions could create for them in the next few years.
Right. So I want to bring up a topic here. Investigative genetic genealogy. This is what solved the Golden State Killer case. And what happened is they had a partial profile of the suspect, couldn't find it anywhere. So what they did is there's an open source DNA website. It's called GED Match, and you can load your DNA profile into there and for free, and it'll try to match you to relatives. Law enforcement used GED Match on the Golden State Killer. They loaded that profile into GED Match and they found a family member. And then they built out that family tree to get back to the Golden State Killer. That's what the investigative genetic genealogy methodology is.
And did they use a search warrant to do that?
You don't have to because it's open source. And at the time, there wasn't any opt-out. But I still think the two-pronged question is in play here. Do I have a reasonable expectation of privacy with my DNA, and would society recognize that as reasonable?
Yeah.
The concern here is that when I'm taking a partial profile, remember, I'm not looking at the exact DNA match, because if I had an exact DNA match, I don't have to do this. I can just run it and say, hey, it's him, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm using a partial. I'm searching an entire database. I don't know if a result's going to come back or not. And I'm using the filter the exact same way that it was used with the Google Geofence. And the Fifth Circuit is saying that is a general warrant, and general warrants are unconstitutional. If there's no warrant, it's even more so unconstitutional.
That's where I get hung up, is that with the genetic genealogy right now, you don't have to have a search warrant to do that. Yeah. Because the courts have not caught up with technology to create these rulings.
And, historically speaking, law enforcement has been very tight-lipped with how they're doing investigative genealogy. Based on this ruling out of the Fifth Circuit, I believe this is going to open the door. That's going to absolutely require more transparency, where we're going to have to look at, okay, wait. What database did you use? Were people opted in or out? Who specifically did you identify? And when you identified that person, had they opted in or out? Did you use a search warrant? How did you get access to that data? And I think there's ways that it's absolutely justified, and it can be very transparent, and it should hold up, and it should be supported. I think there's other ways that it's going to fall in the same case that we're dealing with here with Google Geofences.
Yeah.
And if we lose investigative genealogy, that's a big deal right now.
Right. And not with just Google Geofences and investigative genealogy. You're looking at processes of investigation that law enforcement has used for years, such as tower dumps, right? Yeah. So it really impacts the way law enforcement will be able to investigate using the quality of technology that we have, all the technology that makes our lives better and smarter now. They're going 25 steps backwards.
When killers cannot be apprehended, a lot of them will continue to kill. Mm-hmm. And this is where our privacy rights can sometimes kill us.
Right. There's a lot to think about, a lot to unpack in this episode. And it's hard for me to really define what side of the line I stand on, because I really do see both sides. So
yeah, it'll be an interesting live. I think it'll be really interesting to see some of the feedback. We'll set it up where we can have some really good conversations, get some people fired up, stir that pot a little bit. But yeah, it comes down to privacy versus safety.
Join us next week, Socialites, for Spider and the Fly.
This was the intention, where somebody took a lot of time grooming, got her to willingly leave her house, turn off her phone, hide her communications, get into his car, willingly go with him. And she had a great relationship with her parents.
He just couldn't wait to get his hands on her.